Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of This Is Your Life, and let's assume your life is all about software development and watching Dimecasts. I'm your host, Kyle Baley, and tonight we're going to move ahead on our search functionality for Sharp architecture. It'll be pretty short, so I want to take the opportunity to address a comment from one of the previous Dimecasts that said that because of the single sample, and admittedly it's a rarely bland one, it's using Northwind. Because of that one example application and the limited community, there's not as much appeal of Sharp architecture. That could be, but I see Sharp architecture more as a layer on top of MVC rather than an alternative to it, like say OpenRasta or Fubu MVC, which are both, I think, really good alternatives to MVC that are worth looking into if you decide you want to go that route. For Sharp architecture, it's basically building on top of MVC, and it's more of a collection of different technologies like nhibernate, like inversion with control, things like that, and project templating that get you started faster, but you don't necessarily need to use them. And if you're going to ask a question like, how do I do this in Sharp architecture? Most of the time the question can be generalized to how do I do this in MVC, or how do I do this in nhibernate, or how do I do this with the T4 toolbox or T4 templating or something like that. Sharp architecture is more a collection of base classes and a starting point from which you can build on your own application the way you want to do it. So with that little sales pitch behind me, let's get started on our search functionality. If you recall, we did the functionality where we did the CRUD scaffolding to list the songs. I won't go through it again today. But now we want to build out a search page, one that collects up the parameters of a search and actually performs a search. So how do we start for something like that? The way I generally do it is starting from the URL. How do I want the URL to look to launch the search page? And for that, let's see, how do we want it to look? I'm going to open up right at the bottom here. How do I want the URL to look? I want to look, say, my domain /search by artist John. Okay, if you feast your eyes down here, I'm testing out Vimperator, so apologies if things are a little wacky here. Now, I want this URL here to work. I want to do a search that returns all songs with John in the artist somewhere. Okay, so enter now, and of course this isn't going to work because I haven't actually defined any of that. So how do we get this implemented? We start with the root registrar tests. We've already talked about this to in some respects. How do we want this to look? We should map search by artist to the search controller. Okay, you can already see one deviation between my opinions and Sharp architecture, as I like to have underscores there. Stole that from JP Boodhoo. And how does this look? We would like this URL here, search by artist John to map to a search controller. That's the decision we're making here. And the method we want to call on that is by artist, and it should pass in as the parameter John. Okay? We want this test here to pass. We made some decisions here. We were saying that this URL should invoke some sort of search controller, and that controller should have by artist on it. So in order to get this thing to even compile, of course, we need to create a controller. Search controller. And derives from controller. And it requires a method by artist, action result, and we'll say that's called search term. And I don't care about the implementation right now. All I care about is that this URL is going to invoke this method on that search controller for now. So we've got it compiling. Let's actually run the thing. And we should see pretty quickly the URL did not match any route. So that's fine. Let's go to our root registrar and get it to actually pass this test. We've got the default route in there, controller in action. Let's add in a new one to make this pass. Routes, map route, and we'll call this the search one. Controller, action. So this default route here doesn't map to the URL that we would like, so we have to add in a new one to make it work. And that's it. Do we want to pass in any defaults here? No, I'm not going to pass in any defaults. The reason being, if something doesn't match this exactly, then I want it to default to the default route here. Okay, so we need, if something matches this route exactly, then it'll go on to the controller and the action in the search term there, but it has to match exactly. And that should just about do it. Run that test again. Success. Back to our screen here. This still is not going to pass. But we should get a different error message. Throw new not implemented exception. So it is actually getting to our byArtist method. And so we know that we can actually implement this route and we can actually navigate to this route. And our next Dimecast, what we'll do is actually start the implementation. What's going to happen when we call byArtist. So until then, I told you I'd keep it short, and we'll talk to you next time.